In the isolated mountains of New Zealand, where silence is sacred and faith is measured in eternal vows, something impossible began to happen. One by one, cloistered nuns started experiencing symptoms: nausea, dizziness, swelling, until one of them collapsed on the stone floor with blood on her robes, and a doctor in disbelief confirmed she was pregnant, and she swore by everything holy that she had never been touched by a man. Days later, others followed the same path. The convent became a battlefield of suspicion, fear, guilt, and pain. But what no one knew is that the truth behind those pregnancies involved no sin at all, but rather a conspiracy so deep, so cruel, that when it's revealed, you'll wonder how many other stories have been buried the same way. Because what happened there wasn't just a religious scandal, it was a death sentence. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching this video from? At the precise moment when the sun began to pierce through the thick mist blanketing the Te Urawera hills, the sharp sound of a body hitting stone echoed through the convent's chapel. Sister Moana, always silent, always punctual, had collapsed during morning prayers. When the others rushed to help her, one disturbing detail caught their attention: the blood trickling in a thin stream between her robes. Young Lani was the first to notice the swelling in her abdomen. Trembling, she called for the Mother Superior. Within minutes, panic had seized them all. "She's pregnant," whispered Elsbeth, her voice faltering for the first time in years. The local doctor refused to climb up to the convent, so Elsbeth contacted someone she trusted, Dr. Milsom, sent by the diocese. He confirmed the diagnosis without ceremony. Third month of pregnancy, the chapel fell silent. Through tears, Moana swore she had never been with any man. The other nuns exchanged glances filled with the terror of those who sensed something far greater than themselves approaching. The next day, Sister Elena began vomiting blood. On the third day, it was Sister Eloise who fell to her knees in the refectory, doubled over with intense abdominal pain. 3 nuns, 3 suspicions, 1 mystery that no one dared voice. Mother Elsbeth, rigid as always, tried to maintain order through prayers and silence. But it was already too late. The story had escaped the walls. A delivery driver from the village overheard whispers and spread the rumor. The nuns at St. Inez, they're pregnant. Within 48 hours, the entire village of Tarangi was talking, and judging. The gossip would reach Wellington soon enough. But before that, a letter would be sent. A letter sealed with the initials of someone the Mother Superior had sworn never to seek again. Someone she had loved in the past, and who was now their only hope. His name, Father Ruben Vega. The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of St. Inez convent like a shroud, as if nature itself was trying to hide what was happening within. The building, constructed in 1892 by German missionaries, had weathered countless storms sweeping in from the Tasman Sea. Its thick walls had sheltered generations of women seeking solace in prayer and contemplation. But today, those same walls seemed to press inward, suffocating rather than protecting. Sister Moana lay unconscious on the cold stone floor, her usually pristine white habit stained with crimson. The other nuns formed a circle around her, their faces pale with shock and growing terror. The sound of her body hitting the ground still echoed in their minds, a sound that would haunt them for weeks to come. Lani, barely 27 and still adjusting to convent life, knelt beside Moana with shaking hands. The swelling she had noticed was unmistakable. Having grown up in a large Samoan family, she knew the signs of pregnancy well. But here, in this sacred place, among women who had taken vows of chastity, it seemed impossible. "Fetch Dr. Milsom immediately," Mother Elsbeth commanded, her voice cutting through the chapel's acoustics like a blade. Her weathered hands, marked by decades of prayer and labor, gripped her rosary until her knuckles turned white. At 62, she had seen much in her years leading the convent, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The nearest telephone was in the village, a treacherous 15-minute walk down the winding mountain path. Sister Catherine, the youngest among them, volunteered to make the journey. As she disappeared into the mist, the remaining nuns could only wait and pray. Dr. Milsom arrived within the hour, his black medical bag in hand and his expression grim. He was a man of few words, known throughout the district for his professionalism and discretion. The diocese had recommended him specifically for his ability to handle delicate situations without causing scandal. His examination was thorough but respectful, When he emerged from the small infirmary where they had carried Moana, his face was ashen. "I must speak with you privately, Mother Superior," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They retreated to Elsbeth's sparse office where crucifixes adorned the walls, and the scent of lavender from the convent gardens drifted through the open window. The doctor's words were clinical, precise, devastating. "She is indeed pregnant, approximately 12 weeks along. The bleeding suggests some complications, but nothing immediately life-threatening." He paused, studying Elsbeth's face. "I assume you'll want to handle this matter with the utmost discretion." Elsbeth felt the world tilt beneath her feet. In her 40 years of religious life, she had never faced such a crisis. "Doctor, I need you to understand something. Sister Moana has been cloistered here for 3 years. She has had no contact with men, no opportunity for what you're suggesting." Dr. Milsom's expression remained neutral, professional. "Mother Superior, I can only report what I observe. The pregnancy is real. How it occurred is not my concern." When Moana regained consciousness that evening, her first words were a desperate plea. "I swear by everything holy, I have never been with a man. Never. You must believe me." The anguish in her voice broke something inside Elsbeth. She had known Moana since she was a teenager, had watched her grow in faith and devotion. If anyone in the convent was incapable of deception, it was her. But the evidence was undeniable, and as if the devil himself was orchestrating events, the impossible became a pattern. Sister Elena, a quiet woman from Auckland who had joined the convent to escape a troubled past, began experiencing severe morning sickness. The symptoms were textbook: nausea, fatigue, and a peculiar aversion to the smell of the incense they burned during evening prayers. Then came Sister Eloise, whose sudden collapse in the refectory during lunch sent the remaining nuns into barely contained hysteria. The Frenchwoman, who had spent 15 years in various convents across New Zealand, doubled over in pain so intense that her screams echoed off the stone walls. 3 women, 3 impossible pregnancies, 3 lives turned upside down in the space of a week. The whispers began immediately. In the dormitory after evening prayers, in the kitchen during meal preparation, in the gardens where they tended to vegetables that sustained them through the harsh mountain winters. Doubt crept in like poison, turning sister against sister, friend against friend. "How is this possible?" Sister Catherine asked during a furtive conversation in the bell tower. "We're watched constantly. We're never alone with outsiders." "Perhaps," suggested Sister Margaret, her voice barely audible, "it's a test from God, like the Virgin Mary." But even as the words left her lips, they all knew this was different. The Virgin Mary had been chosen, blessed, visited by angels. This felt like a curse, a punishment for sins they couldn't even name. Mother Elsbeth found herself questioning everything she had believed about her charges, about the sacred space she had protected for so long. The convent, which had been her sanctuary, now felt like a prison where terrible secrets festered in the shadows. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Young Lonnie, despite her fear and confusion, had been paying attention to details others missed. During her time helping in the convent's small library, she had noticed something odd. Deliveries of medical supplies had increased dramatically over the past few months. Vitamins, supplements, things they had never needed before. "Mother Superior," she said quietly after finding Elsbeth kneeling in the chapel one evening, "I think someone has been giving us something we didn't know about." The older woman looked up, her eyes red from crying and sleepless nights. "What do you mean, child?" "The supplements Dr. Milsom recommended. The ones that came with the blessing of the diocese. I don't think they were what we were told they were." A chill ran down Elsbeth's spine. The supplements had arrived with official documentation, bearing the seal of the diocese. They had been presented as routine vitamins to help the nuns maintain their health during the harsh mountain winter. Every sister had been required to take them daily. "Dear God," Elsbeth whispered, the pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning to fall into place. "If what you're suggesting is true." That night, while the others slept, Elsbeth made a decision that would change everything. She retrieved a box from her private quarters, a box she had kept hidden for over 20 years. Inside were letters, photographs, and memories of a life before the convent. A life that had included love, passion, and a man named Ruben Vega. Ruben had been a young seminarian when they met. Their love affair had been brief but intense, ending when she chose the convent over a life with him. He had eventually become a priest, serving in rural parishes across the North Island. They had not spoken in 2 decades, but she knew he was still alive, still serving his calling. With trembling hands, she wrote a letter, not the formal correspondence of a mother superior, but the desperate plea of a woman who had run out of options. She sealed it with wax, using the same seal she had used on love letters 40 years earlier. "Find Father Ruben Vega," she told Lonnie the next morning. "Tell him that Elsbeth needs him. Tell him that the truth is being buried, and only he can help us dig it up." As Lonnie prepared to leave the convent under cover of darkness, none of them knew that their nightmare was just beginning. The scandal that would soon engulf them was not just about unexplained pregnancies. It was about power, manipulation, and the lengths some would go to maintain control over the faithful. The mist that had shrouded the convent that morning would soon lift, revealing truths that would shake the very foundations of their faith. And in the center of it all, 3 women carrying impossible burdens, their lives forever changed by forces beyond their understanding or control. The silence that had once been sacred was about to be shattered forever. The hills that had once offered protection now felt like a prison. Each day brought new symptoms to another nun. Lonnie began experiencing morning sickness that left her retching in the convent's ancient toilets. Sister Florence had inexplicable bleeding that stained her undergarments crimson. 5. They were now 5 women carrying impossible burdens. Mother Elsbeth gathered them all in the chapel and made a solemn plea for silence. But terror had already spread through the stone corridors like wildfire consuming old paper. Trust between the sisters began to crumble. Whispers echoed off vaulted ceilings. Eyes avoided contact. Prayers became disconnected mumblings of fear and confusion. Sister Elena, her face pale as morning mist, spoke quietly to Lonnie during evening prayers. "I dreamed of him, of someone here inside these walls. A man, but I can't remember his face." The nightmare deepened when Bishop Marcellus arrived at the end of that gray afternoon. He came in silence, accompanied by 2 priests and a doctor he trusted implicitly. His bearing was military, his words sharp as winter wind. He didn't ask for explanations, he issued orders. "Internal investigation behind closed doors," he announced to the assembled nuns. "No one speaks to outsiders. No one leaves these grounds." Mother Elsbeth attempted to argue but was cut off with arctic coldness. "You've lost control, sister. The diocese will handle this matter now." Father Amos Leonard observed everything from the shadows, his thin frame moving like a specter through the convent's halls. He was the bishop's right hand, known throughout the district for his unwavering loyalty and disturbing ability to extract confessions from the most reluctant souls. The bishop demanded medical examinations, intense interrogations, and most disturbingly, signatures. Under threat of excommunication, 2 of the younger nuns broke down. Through tears and trembling hands, they signed documents they weren't allowed to read. Elena wept like a child separated from her mother. Mother Elsbeth stared at the altar, feeling something essential dying inside her chest. That same night, Sister Moana tore pages from her personal diary and burned the fragments in a clay pot she kept beside her bed. The ashes drifted through her small window like gray snow. Then, when the convent had settled into its deepest silence, she climbed the narrow stone steps to the bell tower. No one noticed her absence until they heard the scream. The sound that echoed through the valley when her body struck the courtyard stones was unlike anything the village had ever heard. It was the sound of innocence being murdered, of faith being shattered against cold reality. Mother Elsbeth ran through the corridors, her robes billowing behind her like the wings of a dying angel. Her cries for help bounced off the stone walls, but only echoes answered. The bishop ordered the area sealed immediately. Elena collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed against the stones where Moana's blood had pooled. Lonnie screamed until her voice broke. It was the first death, the first casualty of something far more sinister than any of them had imagined. While the body was being removed under cover of darkness, Mother Elsbeth retreated to her quarters and wrote another letter. This time, she didn't use words. She pricked her finger with a pin and let a single drop of blood fall onto the paper. It was a message Reuben would understand, a signal they had used in their youth to indicate desperate danger. The convent that had been their sanctuary was becoming their tomb, and somewhere in the shadows, unseen forces were orchestrating their destruction with methodical precision. The morning after Moana's death brought unwelcome visitors. Cars began arriving at the convent gates before dawn. Journalists, church officials, and curious villagers drawn by rumors that had spread through Tarangi like a virulent disease. The story had mutated as it traveled from mouth to mouth, becoming more scandalous with each telling. 5 nuns pregnant at once, whispered Mrs. Henderson at the village store. Must be something in the water up there. Or someone, added her neighbor, Mrs. Patel, with a knowing look. These religious types, they're always the worst hypocrites. The gossip was poisonous, transforming women who had dedicated their lives to service into objects of speculation and disgust. None of the villagers knew these women personally. They were simply figures in white robes glimpsed occasionally on supply runs to town. But that didn't stop the community from judging them with the fierce certainty of the self-righteous. Bishop Marcellus used the external pressure to tighten his grip on the convent. He installed security at the gates, ostensibly to protect the nuns from unwanted attention, but in reality, to prevent anyone from leaving or entering without his permission. The convent became a fortress with the inhabitants as prisoners. Dr. Milsom arrived for follow-up examinations, his medical bag heavier than usual. The additional supplies he carried were not standard medical equipment. They were tools of intimidation, syringes filled with sedatives, restraints disguised as medical aids, and documents that would strip the nuns of their rights under the guise of mental health concerns. Some of these women are clearly suffering from hysteria, he told the bishop in private. Pregnancy can cause severe mental disturbances. I recommend immediate intervention. The intervention began with Sister Elena. She was the most vocal about her innocence, the most insistent that something unnatural was happening. During her examination, Dr. Milsom administered what he called a calming injection. Elena's protests grew weaker as the sedative took effect, her words becoming slurred and disconnected. "Please," she whispered before losing consciousness. I would never. God help us all." Father Amos watched the proceedings with growing unease. As the bishop's confidant, he had witnessed many church scandals being quietly managed. But this felt different. The methods being employed were more brutal, more systematic, and the women's terror seemed genuine in a way that troubled his conscience. That night, unable to sleep, he began writing in a journal he kept locked in his quarters. The entries were coded, written in a mixture of Latin and English that would be meaningless to casual observers but would preserve the truth if something happened to him. Day 4 of the crisis. The women maintain their innocence despite all pressure. M grows more aggressive in his methods. Something is not right about this situation. The supplements they were given. Need to investigate further. Meanwhile, in the village, Lonnie had successfully made contact with Father Ruben Vega. The old priest lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of Turangi, serving a small congregation of farmers and Maori families. When he opened his door at dawn to find a young nun covered in mud and tears, his first instinct was to offer shelter. But when he read Elsbeth's letter, his world shifted. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same elegant script he had fallen in love with 40 years earlier, and the blood drop on the paper activated memories he had thought safely buried. "She's in trouble," he told Lonnie simply. "Real trouble. The kind that destroys lives and buries truth." Reuben had survived decades in the church by understanding its politics, its power structures, its capacity for both great good and terrible evil. He knew that scandals like this were rarely what they appeared to be. There were always hidden agendas, always someone benefiting from the chaos. "What do you know about the supplements they were taking?" he asked Lonnie. "They came with official documentation," she replied. "The diocese said they were vitamins to help us through the winter. We were all required to take them daily." Reuben's expression darkened. He had heard rumors about experimental treatments being conducted under church auspices, trials that used religious communities as unwitting subjects, but he had never imagined it could happen in his own district. "We need to get samples," he said, "and we need to get them analyzed by someone we trust." The next morning, before they could act on their plan, devastating news arrived. Sister Florence had been found unconscious in her cell, her body showing signs of severe trauma. The official explanation was that she had fallen, but Lonnie knew better. The marks on Florence's arms were consistent with restraints, and her eyes held the vacant stare of someone who had been chemically subdued. "They're silencing them one by one," Lonnie whispered to Reuben. "First Moana, now Florence. How many more will suffer before the truth comes out?" The old priest's hands trembled as he reached for his coat. "None. If I have anything to say about it, it's time to confront the bishop directly." But as they prepared to return to the convent, neither of them knew that their every move was being watched. The bishop had anticipated outside interference and had taken precautions. Phone lines had been tapped, movements tracked, and contingency plans activated. The battle for truth was about to begin in earnest. And in the ancient stone walls of St. Inez Convent, women who had devoted their lives to God were about to discover that their greatest enemy might be the very institution they had served so faithfully. The mist that perpetually shrouded the Teurewera hills seemed thicker that morning, as if the earth itself was trying to hide the sins being committed in its sacred spaces. But mist, like truth, eventually lifts, and when it did, the world would see the full horror of what had been done in the name of faith and authority. The stone walls that had protected the convent for over a century were beginning to crack, and through those cracks the light of justice would eventually shine, though not before more innocent blood was spilled on the altar of institutional power. Sister Lonnie was chosen because she was the youngest, because she hadn't yet shown the symptoms, because she could still run. Mother Elsbeth handed her the letter hidden between the pages of an ancient book of Psalms. The passage was clear, "And the truth shall set you free." With tears in her eyes, Elsbeth said, "Find Reuben. Trust no one else, not even me." That night, Lonnie escaped through the back of the convent while mist concealed the sins and horrors of the courtyard. As she jumped the gate, she was nearly caught by Father Amos, who looked directly at her and simply walked away. The road to the village was long, but Lonnie arrived before dawn. She knocked on Reuben's door with bloodied knees and failing breath. The priest opened the door and took several seconds to recognize her. Upon reading the letter, his hands trembled. That handwriting was unmistakable. Elsbeth, the one he had loved, the one who had chosen faith over him, and now she was begging for help. He knew that by crossing the gates of St. Inez, there would be no return. There was something dark behind those pregnancies, something the church itself wanted to hide, and he was going to find out. The next morning, before they could even depart, news arrived that Sister Florence had been locked in solitary confinement. Without explanation, the village began gathering around the convent, demanding answers. They called them sinners, prostitutes, blasphemers. Reuben looked at Lonnie. "We need proof." And there was only one place they could start: the district hospital, where Dr. Milsom had recorded the first reports. Something about that doctor's name bothered him. And it was only the beginning. The dawn light filtering through Reuben's cottage windows cast long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The priest had spent the night staring at Elsbeth's letter, the words blurring as memories he had buried for decades clawed their way to the surface. Her handwriting hadn't changed. Still the elegant script of a woman educated by German nuns. Still the careful formation of letters that had once spelled out love poems in margins of theological texts. Lonnie sat opposite him, her young face etched with exhaustion and terror. She had barely slept, her mind haunted by images of Moana's broken body and Elena's drugged stupor. The coffee Reuben had made her grew cold as she struggled to find words for the horrors she had witnessed. "They're not just investigating us," she whispered. "They're destroying us, systematically, like they had a plan from the beginning." Reuben nodded grimly. In his 40 years as a priest, he had seen the church's capacity for both mercy and cruelty. He had witnessed cover-ups, seen good people sacrifice to protect institutional interests, but this felt different, more calculated, more sinister. "Tell me about Dr. Milsom," he said, leaning forward. "When did he first appear at the convent?" Lonnie closed her eyes, trying to remember. "About 6 months ago. He came with a letter from the diocese, saying he would be conducting routine health checks." Mother Elsbeth was surprised. We'd never had regular medical visits before, but the letter bore the bishop's seal, and the supplements. They arrived the same day as his first visit. "Boxes of vitamins," he said, "to help us maintain our health during the winter months. Every sister was required to take them daily with breakfast." Reuben's jaw tightened. The timeline was too convenient, too orchestrated. In his experience, when multiple unusual events occurred simultaneously, they were rarely coincidental. "We're going to the hospital," he decided, "and we're going to find out exactly what those supplements contained." The district hospital in Tarangi was a modest brick building that served the scattered communities of the central North Island. Its records department was staffed by Mrs. Gloria Stevenson, a formidable woman in her 60s who had worked there for over 30 years. She knew every doctor, every patient, and every scandal that had passed through those doors. Reuben and Lonnie presented themselves as researchers from the diocese, investigating routine medical procedures at religious institutions. It was technically true, and Mrs. Stevenson, a devout Catholic herself, was eager to help. "Dr. Milsom?" she repeated when they asked about him. "Oh yes, lovely man. Very thorough. Though I must say, some of his methods were rather unconventional." She led them to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder. He requested quite specific tests for the sisters, not the usual blood work we do for routine checkups. More like he was looking for something specific. Reuben studied the medical records with growing alarm. The tests Milsom had ordered were consistent with hormone monitoring, the kind used to track pregnancy or fertility treatments, but there was something else. Something that made his blood run cold. "These supplements," he said, pointing to a prescription form. "They're not vitamins." Mrs. Stevenson adjusted her glasses and peered at the document. "Good heavens, you're right. That's human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. We use it in fertility treatments, but it can also simulate pregnancy symptoms," Reuben finished. "If administered in the right doses over several months, it would cause all the physical signs of early pregnancy. The implications hit them like a physical blow. The nuns hadn't been victims of some mysterious conception. They had been deliberately poisoned, drugged, made to believe they were carrying children when they were simply suffering from artificial hormone manipulation. "But why?" Lonnie whispered. "Why would anyone do such a thing?" Reuben's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Control. Humiliation. Maybe someone wanted to discredit the convent, force its closure, or perhaps, he stopped. A terrible thought forming. Perhaps someone wanted to study the effects of these drugs on a controlled population. Religious women who wouldn't question authority, who would take whatever medication they were given without protest. Mrs. Stevenson had gone pale. "Are you suggesting that Dr. Milsom was conducting unauthorized medical experiments?" "I'm suggesting," Reuben said carefully, "that we need to take these records to someone who can analyze them properly. Someone who isn't connected to the diocese or the hospital." That someone was Dr. Sylvie Notter, a retired forensic pathologist who lived in a cottage overlooking Lake Taupo. Reuben had known her for years. She had testified in several cases where the church had been accused of abuse, always with scrupulous honesty regardless of which side her testimony favored. Dr. Notter examined the medical records with the methodical precision that had made her reputation. After an hour of analysis, she looked up with an expression of barely controlled rage. "This is deliberate poisoning," she said flatly. "The dosages, the timing, the specific combination of hormones. This was designed to create the symptoms of pregnancy while ensuring maximum psychological trauma for the victims. Can you prove it?" Reuben asked. "I can prove what these substances would do to the human body. What I can't prove is who authorized their use or why." She paused, studying the signatures on the prescription forms. "But I know someone who might be able to help with that." Meanwhile, back at the convent, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Bishop Marcellus had declared the facility under ecclesiastical quarantine, meaning no one could enter or leave without his express permission. The remaining nuns were confined to their cells except for meals and mandatory prayer sessions. Sister Elena had been moved to the infirmary after suffering what Dr. Milsom described as a nervous breakdown. In reality, she had been sedated into compliance after repeatedly demanding to speak with outside authorities. Her cries for help had echoed through the stone corridors until the injection took effect. Mother Elsbeth watched helplessly as her community was systematically destroyed. The women who had been like daughters to her were being treated like criminals, their faith shattered, their reputations ruined, and she was powerless to protect them. The bishop's visits to her office had become increasingly threatening. "You understand the gravity of this situation," he had said during their last conversation. "The scandal must be contained. The church's reputation depends on how we handle this crisis." "What about their reputations?" Elsbeth had dared to ask. "What about their lives?" Marcellus had smiled coldly. "They are servants of God. Sometimes service requires sacrifice." But unbeknownst to the bishop, Father Amos was keeping detailed records of everything he witnessed. His conscience, dormant for so many years, had been awakened by the suffering of innocent women. Each evening he wrote in his coded journal, documenting conversations, decisions, and actions that would later prove crucial. Day 6. M has authorized further medical interventions for the affected sisters. The doctor's methods become more aggressive. "I begin to suspect this entire situation has been orchestrated. The supplements, the timing, the doctor's unusual requests. Nothing feels organic. We'll continue to observe and document." As night fell over the Teurawera hills, 3 separate forces were converging on the truth. Reuben and Laney were gathering scientific evidence of the deception. Dr. Notter was analyzing the medical conspiracy, and Father Amos was documenting the cover-up from within. But time was running out. Each day brought new cruelties, new attempts to break the spirits of women whose only crime had been trusting their superiors. And somewhere in the shadows, the architects of this conspiracy were preparing their final move, one that would either bury the truth forever or expose a network of corruption that reached far beyond the walls of one isolated convent. The battle for justice was about to begin in earnest, and the weapons would be truth, courage, and the testimonies of women who refused to be silenced, despite facing the full weight of institutional power arrayed against them. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over Lake Taupo, promising a tempest that would match the one brewing in the hearts of those who had discovered the truth. The time for gentle investigation was over. Now came the reckoning. Father Ruben and Lonnie presented themselves as diocesan researchers and requested access to the medical records of the nuns treated by Dr. Milsom. The receptionist was suspicious, but the mention of the bishop's name opened doors. What they found there made them shudder. All the nuns had received a supplement, recommended by the diocese, a hormonal cocktail containing HCG, a substance that simulates pregnancy. None of them were actually pregnant. It was slow poison. Ruben took the papers to Dr. Sylvie Notter, a retired forensic pathologist he knew and trusted. After analyzing the tests, she murmured, "This isn't an error. This is a setup." Meanwhile, at the convent, Sister Elena had been forcibly taken to an isolated room. Mother Elsbeth no longer had any authority. The bishop controlled the place like a jailer. He promised the community that purification would begin soon. The priests accompanying him followed his orders without question, but Father Amos, in silence, began keeping everything in a diary. His notes, his doubts, his guilt. That would be important later. Back in town, Sylvie proposed something risky. Publicly expose the data, but Ruben hesitated. If they did this without support, they could be discredited. They needed to go to the convent, with the proof, with courage, and with the truth. At nightfall, they set off towards the mist of the hills, not knowing if they would be received or silenced forever. The laboratory in Dr. Notter's cottage was a testament to decades of meticulous forensic work. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with reference materials and testing equipment she had accumulated over her career. The smell of chemical preservatives mingled with the earthy scent of the nearby lake, creating an atmosphere that was both clinical and oddly comforting. Sylvie had spread the medical documents across her large oak table, each page marked with colored tabs and annotated in her precise handwriting. The evidence painted a picture so systematic in its cruelty that even her experienced eye struggled to comprehend the full scope of the conspiracy. "Look at these dosage charts," she said, pointing to a series of graphs Dr. Milsom had carefully maintained. The HCG levels were calibrated to produce maximum psychological impact. Not too little. The symptoms wouldn't convince. Not too much. It might cause dangerous side effects that would prompt outside medical intervention. Ruben studied the charts with growing horror. This wasn't a medical experiment. This was psychological torture. Precisely, and look at this. Sylvie turned to another document, one that made her hands shake with rage. He was tracking their emotional responses. Notes about their distress levels, their confusion, their desperation. He was documenting their suffering like a scientist studying laboratory rats. Lonnie had to sit down, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they had uncovered. But why? What could anyone possibly gain from destroying these women's lives? Dr. Notter removed her glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture Ruben recognized as her way of processing particularly disturbing information. There are several possibilities. Medical experimentation, as we discussed. But there's something else here that troubles me even more. She pulled out a folder marked with the diocese seal. These are property documents. Did you know that St. Inez Convent sits on land worth over $2 million? Prime development property with unobstructed lake views. The implications hit them like a physical blow. If the convent could be closed due to scandal, if the nuns could be discredited and scattered, the valuable land would revert to diocesan control. Land that could be sold to developers or used for more profitable ventures. They weren't just destroying these women's lives for sport, Ruben said quietly. They were clearing them out of the way for money. Back at the convent, the atmosphere had grown increasingly oppressive. Bishop Marcellus had brought in additional security, men who looked more like hired thugs than church officials. They patrolled the corridors, ensuring that no nun could move freely within what had once been their home. Sister Elena lay sedated in the infirmary, her once bright eyes now vacant and unfocused. Dr. Milsom visited twice daily, administering what he called stabilizing treatments, but which were actually cocktails of mood-altering drugs designed to keep her compliant and confused. Mother Elsbeth had been effectively stripped of her authority. Her protests were met with condescending smiles and reminders that the diocese knew what was best for everyone involved. When she demanded to see the medical records of her sisters, she was told that such information was confidential and beyond her security clearance. "You've failed in your duty to maintain order," Bishop Marcellus informed her during their daily meeting. "These women fell into sin under your watch. The least you can do now is cooperate with the remedial measures." But Elsbeth had not survived 40 years in religious life by being passive. That evening, she made her way to the small library where Lonnie had once worked. Hidden behind a row of theological texts, she found what she was looking for: the original bottles from the supplement shipment. The labels were professionally printed, bearing the logo of a pharmaceutical company she didn't recognize, but underneath the primary label, she could see traces of another one that had been covered over. Working carefully with a letter opener, she managed to peel away the top label. What she found underneath made her gasp. The original label identified the contents as fertility hormones intended for a veterinary clinic in Auckland. These weren't even meant for human consumption. They were livestock breeding supplements that had been relabeled and distributed to unsuspecting women. The realization that they had been treated like animals, dosed with veterinary drugs for someone else's profit, filled her with a rage she hadn't felt since her youth. She carefully preserved the evidence, hiding it in a place where only she would think to look. Meanwhile, Father Amos was struggling with his own crisis of conscience. Each entry in his diary became more damning, more evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond the walls of the convent. But documenting the crimes wasn't enough. He knew he would eventually have to act. Day 8. The doctor administered additional sedatives to 3 more sisters today. M spoke openly about preparation for relocation. They plan to scatter these women to different institutions where they can be more easily controlled or silenced. "I can no longer stand by and watch this systematic destruction of innocent lives." That night, as storm clouds gathered over the mountains, Amos made a decision that would change everything. He quietly made copies of the most incriminating pages from his diary and sealed them in an envelope addressed to the Christchurch newspaper. If something happened to him, at least the truth would survive. Dr. Nodder had spent the day making discreet inquiries about Dr. Milsom's background. What she discovered added another layer of horror to their investigation. The man wasn't even a licensed physician. He was a former pharmaceutical researcher who had lost his medical license years earlier for conducting unauthorized experiments on psychiatric patients. "He's been operating under false credentials," she told Reuben and Lonnie when they returned to her cottage. The diocese either didn't check his background, or they knew exactly what they were hiring. Reuben felt the weight of institutional corruption settling on his shoulders like a shroud. How deep does this go? How many people had to be involved to orchestrate something this complex? More than we want to imagine, Sylvie replied grimly. But we have enough evidence now to demand official investigation. The question is, are we brave enough to take on the entire diocesan structure? As if summoned by their conversation, Lonnie's mobile phone rang. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Sister Florence is dying. They gave her something. Come quickly." A friend. The 3 of them stared at the message in horror. The conspiracy wasn't just about false pregnancies or land grabs. It was about eliminating witnesses. And they were running out of time to save the women still trapped within the convent's walls. "We go tonight," Reuben decided. "With everything we've learned, we confront them directly and demand the release of these women." Dr. Nodder nodded. "I'll contact my colleagues in Auckland. If this goes badly, we'll need outside authorities involved immediately." As they prepared for what might be their final confrontation with the forces arrayed against them, none of them could have predicted the shocking revelation that awaited them at the convent. The conspiracy they had uncovered was just the surface of something far more sinister, a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the church hierarchy. The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke as they drove through the mountain passes toward St. Inez. Lightning illuminated the ancient stone walls like a medieval castle under siege, and inside those walls, women who had devoted their lives to serving God were about to discover that their greatest enemy wore the robes of those they had trusted most. The final battle for truth was about to begin, and the weapons would be evidence, courage, and the unshakable faith that justice must prevail, even when it demands challenging the very institutions that claim to represent divine will on earth. The gate of St. Inez Convent creaked under the pressure of the cold winds from Te Urewera. On the other side, Reuben and Lani emerged covered in thick cloaks, carrying a black briefcase. The convent guard hesitated, but upon recognizing the symbol on Reuben's cross, opened the way. Upon entering, the priest was overcome with a chill. The hall now resembled a tribunal. The nuns were seated in rows, faces down, watched like criminals. Elsbeth, kneeling before the altar, didn't even raise her eyes when she saw him. Bishop Marcellus received them with the look of a king who already knew he had won. Reuben asked to speak privately. Marcellus refused. He said there was no more time for heresies and that the next morning, all would be officially expelled from the order. Reuben insisted, "I have proof that all of this was manipulated." Marcellus laughed dryly. "You're too old for fairy tales, Reuben." But when the priest opened the briefcase and showed the tests analyzed by a forensic pathologist, detailing the presence of HCG hormone in the supplements sent to the convent, the entire hall fell silent. Elsbeth finally raised her eyes, hers filled with tears. Marcellus stepped forward. He took the briefcase from Reuben's hands and tore the papers right there, in front of everyone. "This is worth nothing before the word of the church," he said, and then he shouted for the guards to expel them. But something he didn't expect happened. Father Amos Leonard stood up and said in a low voice, "It's not just paper. I have a diary," and he pointed to the inner pocket of his cassock. "I wrote down everything, every order, every name, every coercion." Marcellus's face went livid, and for the first time, he knew he was losing control. The storm that had been building throughout the evening finally unleashed its fury upon the ancient stones of St. Inez Convent. Rain lashed against the Gothic windows while lightning illuminated the interior with stark, dramatic flashes that made the confrontation feel biblical in its intensity. The hall, which had witnessed decades of peaceful prayer, now bore witness to a battle between truth and corruption that would determine the fate of every soul within those walls. Bishop Marcellus stared at Father Amos with a mixture of rage and calculation. The younger priest had always been his most trusted ally, the one who carried out orders without question, who buried inconvenient truths with methodical efficiency. To see him standing there, openly defying authority, was like watching his own shadow rebel against him. "You forget yourself, Amos," Marcellus said, his voice carrying the tone he had used to intimidate countless subordinates over the years. "You forget who gave you everything you have, your position, your authority, your very identity within the church." But Amos was beyond intimidation now. The weeks of watching innocent women suffer had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. A conscience he had thought safely buried beneath layers of institutional loyalty and personal ambition. "I remember perfectly who I used to be," Amos replied, his hand moving protectively to the diary hidden in his cassock. "A man who chose convenience over conscience. A man who enabled evil because it was easier than confronting it. But these women," he gestured toward the rows of nuns, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion, "they've shown me what real faith looks like. And it's nothing like what we've been practicing." The nuns themselves watched this exchange with growing amazement. Many had never heard a priest challenge episcopal authority so directly. Sister Elena, despite her sedation, managed to focus her eyes on the scene unfolding before her. Even in her compromised state, she understood that something momentous was happening. Mother Elsbeth slowly rose from her kneeling position before the altar. Her movement was painful. Weeks of stress and inadequate food had taken their toll on her 62-year-old body. But her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of decades of spiritual leadership. "Enough," she said simply. The word echoed through the stone hall with surprising power. Enough lies, enough manipulation, enough cruelty done in the name of God. She walked toward the center of the hall, positioning herself between the bishop and her sisters. Her white hair, usually hidden beneath her veil, had come loose and flowed around her shoulders like a silver banner. In that moment, she looked less like a defeated religious and more like an avenging angel. "You want to know the truth about this place?" she continued, reaching into her robes and producing the veterinary medicine bottle she had discovered. "Here is your truth. We were fed livestock hormones, treated like breeding animals in an experiment we never consented to participate in." The gasps from the assembled nuns were audible even over the storm outside. Several sisters began to weep openly as the full scope of their victimization became clear. They had been not just deceived but dehumanized, reduced to test subjects for someone else's twisted agenda. Dr. Milsom, who had been standing quietly in the shadows throughout the confrontation, suddenly moved toward the door. But Reuben was faster. positioning himself to block the exit. "Going somewhere, doctor?" Reuben asked. "Or should I say, former pharmaceutical researcher? Yes, we know about your background, your lost medical license, your history of unauthorized experiments on vulnerable patients." Milsom's composure cracked for the first time since his arrival at the convent. "You don't understand the larger picture," he said desperately. "This research could have helped countless women. The data we collected, the data you collected," interrupted Dr. Sylvie Nodder, who had followed Reuben and Lonnie into the hall, "was obtained through torture and deception. No legitimate medical board would ever approve such methods." Bishop Marcellus realized that his carefully constructed conspiracy was unraveling faster than he could contain it. Too many people now knew too much. Too many witnesses had gathered too much evidence. His only remaining option was to discredit his accusers before they could reach outside authorities. "This is all very dramatic," he said, attempting to regain control of the situation. "But you forget that I represent the authority of the church in this region. My word carries weight that yours never will. Who will believe a disgraced old priest, a runaway novice, and a collection of hysterical women suffering from obvious mental disturbances?" But as he spoke these words, another figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the hall. Mrs. Gloria Stevenson from the district hospital stepped into the light, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Perhaps they'll believe the official medical records that Dr. Milsom thought he had destroyed," she said firmly. "Records that show systematic fraud, unauthorized prescription of controlled substances, and falsification of medical credentials." The bishop's face went white. He had not anticipated that his web of corruption extended far enough to be traced by hospital administrators. Mrs. Stevenson, it turned out, had been conducting her own investigation after becoming suspicious of Dr. Milsom's unusual requests and unconventional methods. Father Amos chose that moment to step forward and place his diary on the altar, the same altar where these women had prayed for guidance and strength throughout their ordeal. "Everything is documented," he said. "Every conversation, every decision, every act of cruelty committed in these walls. Names, dates, times, the complete record of how institutional power was used to destroy innocent lives." The storm outside seemed to pause, as if nature itself was waiting to hear what would happen next. In the sudden silence, Sister Lanny's voice rang out clear and strong. "We were never pregnant. We were never sinners. We were victims of men who thought our lives were worth less than their ambitions." The other nuns began to stand, one by one, until all were on their feet. Some still swayed from the effects of unwanted medication, others trembled from weakness and fear, but they stood together, united in their shared suffering and their shared determination to see justice done. Bishop Marcellus looked around the hall and saw his authority crumbling like ancient parchment. The careful structure of lies and intimidation he had built was collapsing under the weight of truth spoken by those he had considered powerless. "This isn't over," he said, his voice now lacking its earlier confidence. "The church has resources you cannot imagine. Lawyers, influence, connections that reach far beyond this isolated place." But even as he spoke, the sound of vehicles approaching through the storm could be heard outside. Mrs. Stevenson had made more than just copies of medical records. She had also contacted the authorities. Police cars and an ambulance were making their way up the mountain road, their lights cutting through the darkness like harbingers of justice. Mother Elsbeth walked to one of the tall windows and watched the approaching vehicles. "You're right," she said quietly. "This isn't over, but perhaps for the first time in months it's beginning to be right." The confrontation that had begun with fear and intimidation was ending with the promise of accountability. But the road ahead would be long and difficult. The women of St. Inez had survived the conspiracy against them, but they still had to rebuild their lives from the ruins of their shattered faith. As the first police officers entered the hall, Bishop Marcellus made one final attempt to maintain his dignity. But dignity, like authority, cannot survive exposure to the harsh light of truth. And tonight, in the ancient stone halls of St. Inez Convent, truth was finally having its day. The day dawned with a crowd at the convent gates. News of the supposed pregnancies had spread like poison, fueled by an inflammatory speech from Marcellus himself the night before, calling the nuns traitors to the faith. Elsbeth, Reuben, Lonnie, and Amos were surrounded. The bishop demanded that the nuns be brought to the gate for their public expulsion. They were dragged like defendants under insults, spittle, and looks of disgust. Some held rosaries, others cried in silence. Elena, in shock, repeated verses as if trying to erase herself from reality. When Reuben tried to intervene, one of the guards pushed him violently. Lonnie, overcome with despair, shouted, "They're not pregnant. You've been deceived." But no one listened. The first stone hit Sister Florence's shoulder. Then another struck Elena's face. It was at that moment that Elsbeth, kneeling in the middle of the courtyard, shouted with all the strength of her soul, "No! None of these women sinned." The crowd hesitated. The fury was interrupted by a metallic sound. Reuben had raised an iron cross he wore around his neck and hurled it to the ground. "If this is your faith, then it's not faith, it's blindness." The silence was broken by a sharp scream from the middle of the crowd. A child holding a diary in her hands. She was the granddaughter of a local resident and had found Father Amos's notebook thrown near the gate. A man took the diary and read aloud. Names, dates, threats made, forced confessions. The pages didn't lie. The crowd fell into confusion. Marcellus tried to flee through the back, but he was surrounded by the same mob he had fed, and what happened to him was crueler than any ecclesiastical punishment. The dawn mist that perpetually shrouded the Teorawera Mountains seemed different that morning, thicker, more oppressive, as if the very air was contaminated with the poison of lies that had been spread throughout the community. By 7 o'clock, over 200 villagers had gathered outside the convent gates, their faces twisted with righteous indignation and mob mentality. Word had spread through Tarangi like wildfire. In the pub, at the general store, in the small churches that dotted the rural landscape, everywhere people gathered, the story grew more scandalous. 5 nuns pregnant simultaneously. A convent turned into a den of sin. Holy women revealed as hypocrites of the worst kind. Mrs. Henderson from the village store had been particularly vocal in spreading the tale. "I always knew there was something unnatural about that place," she told anyone who would listen. "All those women living together cut off from proper society. It's not natural, I tell you. Breeds all sorts of wickedness." Her words found fertile ground in a community that had always viewed the convent with a mixture of respect and suspicion. The nuns were foreign to most villagers. Educated women who spoke of theology and philosophy, who read books in Latin and German, who seemed to inhabit a world far removed from the practical concerns of farming and small-town life. Bishop Marcellus had calculated his inflammatory speech perfectly. Standing on the steps of St. Mary's Church in the village center the previous evening, he had painted a picture of moral corruption that demanded immediate and decisive action. "These women have betrayed not just their vows, but the trust of every faithful Catholic in this region," he had declared to the assembled crowd. "They have turned a house of God into a mockery of everything we hold sacred. The Church can no longer protect them from the consequences of their choices." He had been careful not to explicitly call for violence, but his meaning was clear. The community had been betrayed, and the community had the right to demand accountability. By the time he finished speaking, the crowd was already beginning to move toward the mountain road. Now, as the morning sun struggled to penetrate the gathering storm clouds, that same crowd pressed against the convent gates with an energy that bordered on the primal. Men who had never spoken a harsh word in church shouted obscenities. Women who prided themselves on Christian charity spat on the ground and cursed the names of women they had never met. At the center of it all stood Father Mackenzie, the local parish priest who had been quietly building resentment against the convent for years. He saw the crisis as an opportunity to finally assert his authority over what he considered a competing religious institution in his territory. "Bring them out," he shouted, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Let them face the community they've dishonored. Let them explain their sins in the light of day." Inside the convent, the remaining nuns huddled together in the main hall, listening to the growing roar of voices outside. Many were still weak from the effects of the hormonal manipulation they had endured. Sister Elena could barely stand without assistance, her mind still clouded by the sedatives Dr. Milsom had administered. Mother Elsbeth stood at the tall windows, watching the crowd with a mixture of sorrow and determination. These were people she had served in various capacities for decades, baptizing their children, counseling their families, providing food and shelter during difficult times. To see them transformed into a vengeful mob was perhaps the most painful betrayal of all. "They don't know," she said quietly to Sister Laney, who stood beside her. "They truly believe we've sinned. In their minds, they're defending their faith." But knowing the crowd's ignorance didn't make their hatred any less dangerous. When Bishop Marcellus ordered the gates opened and the nuns brought forward, Elsbeth understood that they were walking into a gauntlet that could very well prove fatal. The procession that emerged from the convent was heartbreaking in its dignity. 5 women, faces pale but heads held high, walking slowly toward a crowd that saw them as fallen angels deserving of punishment. They wore their habits with the same reverence they had always shown, even knowing that those same robes now marked them as targets for public scorn. The first stone came from somewhere in the back of the crowd, a fist-sized rock that struck Sister Florence's shoulder with enough force to spin her around. She stumbled but did not fall, her face registering shock rather than pain. The sight of blood on her white habit seemed to inflame the crowd rather than calm it. "Whores!" someone shouted. "Blasphemers! How many men?" called another voice. "How many did you seduce with your false piety?" Sister Elena, already unsteady on her feet, swayed as another stone found its mark. This one caught her cheek, opening a cut that immediately began to bleed. The sight of her blood seemed to satisfy something primal in the crowd's collective psyche. It was then that Mother Elsbeth made her stand. Kneeling in the courtyard, her voice rising above the mob's roar with an authority that had been built over decades of spiritual leadership, she cried out, "No! None of these women sinned!" The power in her voice was so unexpected, so absolute, that it cut through the crowd's fury like a blade. For a moment, silence fell over the assembled villagers. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself was listening to her words. Father Reuben chose that moment to make his own dramatic gesture. The iron cross he had worn around his neck for 40 years, a symbol of his faith and his calling, caught the morning light as he raised it high above his head. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he hurled it to the ground where it rang against the stone like a bell tolling the death of illusion. "If this is your faith," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the crowd, "then it is not faith at all. It is blindness. It is hatred dressed in holy robes." The crowd shifted uneasily. Many had known Father Reuben for years, had seen him perform marriages and funerals, had sought his counsel in times of crisis. To see him reject the very symbol of his calling was profoundly disturbing, regardless of their feelings about the nuns. But it was a child's voice that truly shattered the mob's certainty. 7-year-old Emma Patterson, granddaughter of one of the village's most vocal critics of the convent, had been playing near the gates when she discovered something that would change everything. "Grandmama," she called, running toward the crowd with a leather-bound book clutched in her small hands. "I found this by the wall. It has writing in it." Emma's grandfather, Tom Patterson, took the diary from her with rough hands. He was a man of limited education but sufficient literacy to understand what he was reading. As his eyes moved across Father Amos's careful script, his expression changed from anger to confusion to horror. "Names," he said slowly, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "Dates. Orders given." He looked up at the crowd, then back at the diary. "Threats. Coercion. False medical reports." Other villagers pressed closer, demanding to hear more. Tom continued reading, his voice growing stronger as the implications of what he was discovering became clear. Day 3. M ordered additional sedatives for Sister Elena despite her pleas for explanation. The women's terror appears genuine, beginning to question the official narrative. Day 5. Dr. Milsom administered substances he claimed were vitamins, found empty vials in medical waste. Contents were livestock hormones. Day 7. Witnessed M destroy evidence of supplement composition. This entire situation appears orchestrated from the beginning. The diary contained dozens of such entries, each one documenting the systematic destruction of innocent women's lives. Names, dates, times, all recorded with the precision of a man who understood the importance of bearing witness to truth. As the reality of what they had been told, and what they had believed, began to sink in, the crowd's anger took a new direction. The stones that had been intended for the nuns were suddenly being hurled at Bishop Marcellus, who had been watching the proceedings from what he thought was a safe distance. "Liar!" shouted Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who had been so eager to spread gossip about the nuns' supposed sins. "You told us they were sinners. You told us they had betrayed their vows." The bishop tried to retreat toward the convent buildings, but found his path blocked by villagers who had surrounded him with the same efficiency they had once shown in threatening the nuns. The mob that he had so carefully cultivated and directed was now turning its fury on him with compound interest. What happened next was swift and brutal. Hands grabbed at his episcopal robes, tearing the fine fabric and the symbols of authority it bore. Fists struck his face and body, while voices screamed accusations and curses. The man who had orchestrated the destruction of innocent lives was experiencing a taste of the violence he had so callously encouraged. When the police finally arrived and restored order, Bishop Marcellus was found unconscious and bleeding in the mud beside the convent gates. His attackers had melted back into the crowd, becoming anonymous faces in a sea of people who suddenly claimed to have had nothing to do with the violence. But justice, when it finally came, would prove to be more complex than simple mob revenge. The real reckoning was still to come, and it would demand more than just physical retribution. It would require the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust, restoring dignity, and finding a way forward from the ruins of shattered faith. As the crowd gradually dispersed and the nuns were helped back inside the convent, Mother Elsbeth stood in the courtyard holding Father Reuben's discarded cross. The metal was cold in her hands, but it still carried the weight of decades of sincere faith. Faith that had been tested but not destroyed by the evil it had encountered. The storm was passing, but the real work of healing was just beginning. Marcellus was found unconscious in the woods by local police, injured, exposed, and muttering disconnected prayers. When taken to hospital, he refused to speak. The church, pressured by public repercussion, decided to excommunicate him quietly and remove him from public life. Father Amos formally handed over the diary to a tribunal and abandoned his cassock days later. He could no longer pray. Elsbeth returned to the convent, but found only the remnants of a shattered faith. The nuns were all transferred to different religious houses, except Lonnie. Lonnie decided to stay beside the Mother Superior. The two began a routine of silence and reconstruction, until one afternoon they found a small box left by someone anonymous on the altar. Inside was Reuben's cross, and a letter. It was from him. He was leaving for the north, to live among the Maori community, and help women victims of domestic violence. He wrote with emotion, "They weren't pregnant, but they were wounded, and now they can finally give birth to something new. Justice." Elsbeth cried in silence. Lonnie kissed the cross and said, "Justice isn't the end. It's the beginning." But the pain hadn't departed. On a gray dawn, Sister Elena, who had been transferred to another order, was found dead. No note, no explanation, only the sign of a broken rosary in her hand. The news devastated Elsbeth and Lonnie and prompted an unexpected gesture. They opened the convent gates to the world. They created there a new order, without vows of silence, a refuge for women rejected by society, for those who carried wounds that no one saw, a place where faith was born, from the ground of pain. The weeks following the exposure of the conspiracy brought a strange quietude to St. Inez Convent. The absence of other nuns made the ancient stone corridors echo with a loneliness that seemed to seep into the very walls. Mother Elsbeth and Sister Lonnie moved through their daily routines like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to familiar rituals while the world around them had fundamentally changed. The media attention had been intense, but brief. Reporters from Auckland and Wellington had descended upon the valley like carrion birds, eager to document the scandal for their audiences. Headlines screamed about church corruption and fake pregnancy scandal, but the nuanced reality of what these women had endured was lost in the sensationalism. After a few weeks, the story faded from public consciousness, replaced by other scandals and newer tragedies. But for those who had lived through it, the trauma was far from over. Sister Florence, transferred to a convent in Canterbury, struggled with severe depression and anxiety attacks. Sister Catherine, relocated to Auckland, found herself unable to trust any male authority figure, religious or otherwise. Each woman carried invisible scars that would take years to heal, if they ever did. The church's response had been swift and calculated. Bishop Marcellus was quietly excommunicated and disappeared from public life so completely that some wondered if he had left the country entirely. Dr. Milsom faced criminal charges for fraud and practicing medicine without a license. But his trial would be a long, drawn-out affair that promised little satisfaction for his victims. Father Amos's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The man who had been Marcellus's right hand, who had enabled so much suffering through his passive compliance, could no longer wear the collar that had once defined his identity. He submitted his resignation to the diocese with a simple letter: "I can no longer represent an institution that values reputation over truth, authority over compassion." His diary, which had proven so crucial in exposing the conspiracy, was entered as evidence in multiple legal proceedings. But giving testimony and providing evidence wasn't enough to absolve him of his own guilt. The faces of the women he had watched suffer haunted his dreams, and he found that prayer, once as natural as breathing, had become impossible. On a cold Tuesday morning in late autumn, Amos knocked on the door of a small cottage outside Rotorua. When the door opened, he faced a Maori woman named Aroha, whose husband had been killed in a workplace accident. She had 3 children and was struggling to keep her family together while fighting the company that had caused her husband's death. "I heard you might need help with your legal case," Amos said simply. "I used to be a priest, now I'd like to just be useful." Aroha studied his face for a long moment, seeing something in his eyes that spoke of shared loss and genuine remorse. "Come in," she said. "We can always use another pair of hands." Meanwhile, at St. Inez, Mother Elsbeth struggled with her own crisis of faith. The institution she had served for 40 years had betrayed not just her, but the women under her care. Every prayer felt hollow. Every ritual seemed tainted by the knowledge of how easily sacred things could be corrupted by human greed and cruelty. Lonnie, despite being the youngest and most recent addition to the community, had emerged as a pillar of strength. Her decision to remain at the convent when she could have left and started a new life elsewhere spoke to a courage that impressed even Elsbeth. Together they maintained the basic routines of prayer and work, but both knew they were going through the motions while they figured out what came next. The answer arrived on a gray afternoon, when they discovered a wooden box placed carefully on the altar. There was no note explaining how it had gotten there, no indication of who had brought it. Inside, wrapped in white cloth, was Father Reuben's iron cross, the same one he had thrown to the ground during the confrontation with the mob. Beneath the cross was a letter written in Reuben's careful script. "My dear Elsbeth, by the time you read this, I will be gone from this place that holds too many painful memories for both of us. I have found work with a women's shelter in Kaitaia, helping Maori women escape violent relationships. It seems fitting that my last service should be to women who have been broken by men they trusted. You asked me once if I still believed in God after everything we've seen. I told you then that I didn't know. I still don't know about God, but I know about goodness. I've seen it in you, in Lonnie, in the courage of women who refused to be silenced even when the whole world seemed arrayed against them. They weren't pregnant, these sisters of yours, but they were wounded in ways that may never fully heal. Yet from that wounding, something new can be born. Not children of flesh, but something more precious. Justice, truth, the courage to stand against institutional evil. The cross I leave with you is not a symbol of the church that betrayed us. It is a reminder that some things are worth suffering for, worth fighting for, worth rebuilding from the ground up when they have been corrupted beyond repair. Do not let them win by destroying your faith entirely. Transform it. Make it into something that serves the vulnerable rather than the powerful. Make it into something worthy of the women who were sacrificed on the altar of men's ambitions. I loved you once, and in my way I love you still. Not with the passion of youth, but with the deeper love of shared purpose and mutual respect. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more necessary than you can imagine. Build something beautiful from these ashes. Build something that would make those women proud. With eternal respect and affection, Reuben. Elsbeth read the letter 3 times before the tears made it impossible to continue. When she looked up, she found Lonnie watching her with eyes that held both compassion and determination. "What do we do now?" Lonnie asked softly. Elsbeth held up the iron cross, feeling its weight and the history it carried. "We begin again," she said. "But this time we build something different. Something that can't be corrupted because it belongs to the people it serves, not to the institution that claims to oversee it." The decision to transform St. Inez from a cloistered convent into a refuge for vulnerable women didn't happen overnight. It required months of legal wrangling with the diocese, which was initially reluctant to cede control of the valuable property. But the public relations nightmare of the scandal gave Elsbeth leverage she wouldn't normally have had. The first woman to seek shelter at the new refuge was Maria Santos, a young mother fleeing an abusive husband. She arrived at the gates on a rainy Thursday evening with 2 small children and nothing but the clothes on her back. When Elsbeth opened the door and invited her in without questions or conditions, Maria broke down in tears. "I don't understand," she sobbed. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Elsbeth smiled for the first time in months. "Because someone should have helped us when we needed it most," she replied. "And because that's what faith really means. Not belief in institutions or authorities, but belief in our obligation to care for one another." But even as new hope began to grow within the walls of St. Inez, tragedy struck from an unexpected direction. Sister Elena, who had been relocated to a convent in Christchurch, was found dead in her cell on a gray winter morning. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but those who knew her suspected that the trauma she had endured had finally claimed its ultimate price. There was no suicide note, No explanation for why a woman of only 35 would simply stop living. But in her hand was found a broken rosary, the same one she had carried since her novitiate years, now shattered beyond repair like her faith in the institution she had served. The news of Elena's death reached Elsbeth through an official letter from the diocese. It was cold, formal, devoid of any acknowledgement of the role the church's own actions had played in driving a young woman to her grave. Reading it, Elsbeth felt something harden inside her chest. Not bitterness, but a crystalline determination that Elena's death would not be meaningless. That afternoon, she and Lonnie made their way to the convent gates and, for the first time in over a century, threw them open to the world. They would never be closed again. Elena died because she had nowhere to go when the world betrayed her, Elsbeth said to the small group of reporters who had come to cover the transformation of St. Inez. We're going to make sure that never happens to another woman. This place will be a sanctuary for anyone who needs one. No questions asked, no judgments passed, no vows required, except the commitment to help one another heal. The Kohai Refuge, as it came to be known, would grow slowly but steadily. Women arrived seeking shelter from violence, from poverty, from institutions that had failed them. Some stayed for weeks, others for years. A few, like Lonnie, chose to make the refuge their permanent home and life's work. But the most powerful testament to the transformation of St. Inez came not from the women who found shelter there, but from the man who had once helped orchestrate their persecution. Father Amos, now simply Amos Leonard, arrived at the refuge on a snowy December evening carrying a duffel bag and wearing civilian clothes. I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, he said to Elsbeth, but I need to do something meaningful with what's left of my life. I need to try to make amends. Elsbeth studied his face for a long moment, seeing the genuine remorse and the deep exhaustion of a man who had been living with unbearable guilt. Amends aren't something you make, she said finally. They're something you live. If you want to stay, you stay as a worker, not as penance. These women don't exist to absolve your conscience. Amos nodded, understanding the terms. I just want to be useful, he said. I want to help build something better than what I helped destroy. It would be a long road to redemption, if redemption was even possible, but in the daily work of providing shelter, food, and safety to women who had been abandoned by the systems meant to protect them, all of them, survivors and reformed enabler alike, began to find something resembling peace. Justice, as Lonnie had said, was not the end. It was only the beginning. St. Inez Convent no longer had high walls, nor iron gates. It was renamed Kohai Refuge, after a native flower that resists the wind even when fragile. There, abandoned women, former nuns, abuse survivors, and rejected mothers found a home. Lonnie became the director of the house, and Elsbeth, even though ill, continued to welcome each one as if they were daughters. Their story spread, first through the village, then throughout the country, and one day, a journalist asked Elsbeth if she still believed in God. She replied, I believe in women who don't surrender. The convent was visited by authorities, by priests, by reporters, but never again by bishops. The church, ashamed, sent a letter of forgiveness, which was never read in public. Elsbeth had it hung on the kitchen wall, among the dishes as a reminder that the sacred can also be dirty. Reuben's cross remained on the altar, but no one touched it, and in a silent gesture, Lonnie began wearing the same necklace, not as faith, but as memory, a symbol that some truths hurt, but need to be told. At the 3-year anniversary ceremony of the refuge's inauguration, a group of girls played music in the garden. Among them, a girl held an old diary. She said it belonged to her grandmother. It was Amos's diary. The cycle had closed, and Elsbeth, now with nearly blind eyes, murmured, the greatest pregnancy wasn't of the body, it was of the soul, and today, they gave birth to freedom. The crowd applauded and cried. The story was complete. 3 winters had passed since the day the gates of St. Inez Convent were thrown open to the world. The stone walls that had once confined women in religious isolation now sheltered a different kind of community, one built on healing rather than hierarchy, on mutual support rather than blind obedience. The transformation had not been easy. In those first months, Elsbeth and Lonnie had worked 18-hour days, cleaning rooms that had been abandoned, repairing damage caused by neglect, and most importantly, learning how to trust again. The diocese had initially resisted their plans, threatening legal action to reclaim the property, but the media attention surrounding the scandal had made such resistance politically impossible. The first woman to seek shelter at what would become Kohai Refuge was Maria Parata, a young Maori mother fleeing an abusive relationship. She arrived on a rain-soaked evening in late autumn, carrying her 2-year-old daughter and nothing else. When Elsbeth opened the door, Maria's first words were an apology. "I'm sorry to bother you," she whispered. I heard this might be a safe place." Elsbeth's response had set the tone for everything that followed. "You're not bothering anyone, dear. You're home." Word spread slowly through networks of social workers, women's advocates, and survivors who understood the desperate need for genuine sanctuary. Unlike other shelters, Kauai Refuge imposed no time limits, required no religious participation, and asked no questions about the circumstances that had brought women to their door. The only requirement was respect for the safety and dignity of others. By the end of the first year, they were housing 12 women and 5 children. By the second year, they had expanded into additional buildings on the property and were serving as a model for similar refugees throughout New Zealand. Government funding followed, along with private donations from people who had been moved by the story of how suffering had been transformed into service. Lani had emerged as a natural leader, her combination of administrative competence and genuine compassion making her indispensable to the refuge's operations. She coordinated with police, social workers, lawyers, and healthcare providers, ensuring that the women who came to them received not just shelter, but comprehensive support for rebuilding their lives. But it was Elsbeth who remained the refuge's spiritual center, though she would have rejected such a title. At 65, her health was declining. Diabetes had weakened her eyesight, and the stress of recent years had taken its toll on her heart. Yet she continued to greet each new arrival personally, to listen to their stories without judgment, and to offer the kind of unconditional acceptance that many had never experienced. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. Reporters from across the Pacific had descended upon the refuge, eager to document the transformation of scandal into salvation, but Elsbeth had learned to manage the publicity carefully, using it to raise awareness and funds while protecting the privacy of the women they served. It was during one such interview, with a journalist from the New Zealand Herald, that Elsbeth had delivered the quote that would become synonymous with Kauai Refuge. Asked if she still believed in God after everything that had happened, she had paused for a long moment before responding. "I believe in women who don't surrender," she said simply. "I believe in the strength that emerges from shared pain, and the healing that comes from refusing to let cruelty have the final word. If that's not divine, then I don't know what is." The church's response to the refuge had been complex and often contradictory. Local priests occasionally visited, some offering genuine support, and others clearly uncomfortable with the refuge's independence from ecclesiastical authority. Social justice advocates within the broader Catholic community had embraced Kauai as an example of faith in action, while conservative elements continued to view it with suspicion. The letter of forgiveness from the diocese had arrived on official letterhead 6 months after the refuge opened. It was a masterpiece of institutional language, acknowledging regrettable events while accepting no responsibility for the systematic abuse that had occurred. Elsbeth had read it once, then deliberately hung it on the kitchen wall next to the daily cleaning schedule. A reminder that even sacred institutions could produce profane documents. Reuben's iron cross remained on what had once been the convent's altar, now transformed into a meditation space that welcomed people of all faiths and none. It had become an unofficial symbol of the refuge, representing not religious orthodoxy, but the courage to stand for truth regardless of consequences. Lani had begun wearing an identical cross, not as a statement of faith, but as a remembrance of the price paid for justice. The most powerful testament to the refuge's impact came not from official recognition or media coverage, but from the women whose lives had been transformed there. Women like Janet McLeod, who had arrived broken by years of domestic violence and left as a certified counselor specializing in trauma recovery. Women like Patricia Williams, who had come seeking shelter and stayed to establish the refuge's legal aid clinic. Women like Ann Thompson, whose children had learned to laugh again in the safety of Kauai's gardens. But perhaps the most moving moment in the refuge's short history came during the 3rd anniversary celebration. The courtyard was filled with women and children, along with supporters from throughout the region. A small group of local teenagers had volunteered to provide music for the occasion, their voices blending in harmonies that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Among the musicians was 15-year-old Emma Patterson, the same child who had found Father Amos's diary during the confrontation 3 years earlier. Now a confident young woman with dreams of studying social work, she had brought something special to share with the gathering. "My grandmother wanted me to give this back to where it belongs," she announced, holding up the leather-bound diary that had helped expose the conspiracy. She said it's part of the story now, and stories should stay where they can help people remember. Elsbeth, her vision too poor now to read the diary's pages but her memory clear about its contents, accepted the gift with trembling hands. The circle was indeed closing, the evidence of past wrongs being transformed into a testament to present healing. "The greatest pregnancy," she said to the assembled crowd, her voice still strong despite her failing body, "wasn't of the body. It was of the soul. We carried pain and trauma for months, not knowing what we would give birth to. But today I see what we've brought into the world. Freedom. Freedom from shame, from silence, from accepting injustice as inevitable." The applause that followed was mixed with tears, from women who understood too well the journey from victimization to empowerment, from supporters who had witnessed the transformation, from children who had learned that home could be a place of safety rather than fear. As the celebration continued into the evening, 3 figures stood quietly at the edge of the gathering. Father Amos, now simply Amos Leonard, had driven down from Rotorua, where he worked with a legal aid clinic serving indigenous communities. Dr. Sylvie Notter had come from her retirement in Taupo, still sharp and committed to justice despite her advancing years. And Father Reuben, gray-haired and weathered by his work in the far north, had made the journey to see what had grown from the seeds of their shared courage. None of them sought recognition or attention. They simply wanted to witness what was possible when people chose to transform suffering into service, when they refused to let institutional power crush individual dignity, when they believed that justice was not just an ideal, but an achievable reality. The story that had begun with false accusations and genuine terror had become something none of them could have imagined, a beacon of hope for women throughout New Zealand and beyond. The house that had once imprisoned women in the name of religious devotion had become a sanctuary where faith was redefined as the commitment to care for one another. As the last visitors departed and the refugee settled into evening quiet, Elsbeth sat in her small office reviewing the day's events. The wall beside her desk was covered with photographs, images of women who had found safety at Kauai, children who had learned to trust again, families reunited after trauma had torn them apart. At the center of the display was a simple wooden plaque bearing the refuge's motto, words that had emerged from their collective experience. "Here, truth is told, dignity is restored, and tomorrow is always possible." Lonnie knocked softly on the doorframe before entering with a cup of tea. At 30, she had the confidence of someone who had found her calling, and the wisdom of someone who had survived genuine adversity. Her decision to dedicate her life to the refuge was not sacrifice, but fulfillment, the natural expression of lessons learned through suffering and healing. "Another good day," she said, settling into the chair across from Elsbeth's desk. 3 new referrals from Auckland, and the university wants to send more social work students for practicum placements. Elsbeth nodded, pleased but not surprised. Word of Kauai's innovative approach to supporting vulnerable women had spread throughout the professional community. They were proving that effective care required more than good intentions. It demanded respect for the autonomy and dignity of those being served. "And the reporter from Australian Women's Weekly wants to do a follow-up story," Lonnie continued. "Something about how the scandal became a success story." "Tell her we're not a success story," Elsbeth replied gently. "We're just women who decided that yesterday's pain doesn't have to define tomorrow's possibilities." Outside, the cowhigh trees that gave the refuge its name were beginning to show the first signs of spring growth. Soon they would burst into brilliant yellow bloom, their flowers brightening the landscape with color that seemed to emerge from nowhere after the darkness of winter. It was a fitting metaphor for what had happened within these walls, the transformation of winter into spring, of despair into hope, of institutional betrayal into community healing. The women who lived and worked at Kauai Refuge understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that would outlive any individual and continue to offer sanctuary for as long as there were women who needed it. The story that had begun with impossible pregnancies and institutional corruption had become something much more profound, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of community to heal wounds that once seemed fatal. It was a story that would be told for generations, inspiring others to believe that even the most devastating betrayals could be transformed into opportunities for grace. As night settled over the Te Urewera Hills, The refugee glowed with warm light from windows that welcomed rather than confined. Inside, women from different backgrounds and circumstances shared meals, stories, and the quiet knowledge that they were safe. Children played in hallways that had once echoed with the footsteps of confined religious, their laughter bringing life to spaces that had known too much silence. The greatest pregnancy had indeed been of the soul, and what it had brought forth was not scandal or shame, but the radical possibility that love could triumph over institutional power, that truth could overcome systematic deception, and that women who refused to surrender could transform the very meaning of sanctuary. The story was complete, but the work continued. And in that continuation, in the daily choice to transform pain into purpose, lay the true victory over those who had sought to destroy innocent lives in service of their own ambitions. How many truths have you seen buried in the name of appearances, authority, or fear? And if it were you in there being falsely accused, humiliated in public, would you have the strength to cry out for justice, or would you stay silent like so many have done? Would you have the courage to start over from scratch, even after losing everything? Your honor, your faith, your hope? This isn't just a story about nuns, church, or betrayal. It's a story about what happens when courage refuses to die, even in silence. About what flourishes when truth, no matter how painful, finally comes to light. And about what it really means to be just when everyone else is wrong. If this story moved you, like, share, and follow the channel. Perhaps someone you know needs to hear exactly this today. And tell me in the comments, from which part of the world are you watching? Your presence here makes all the difference.